The Data Collectors. Written by Danielle Palli. Narrated by Graham Mack and Danielle Palli. Section 1. If human laws are universal laws, then consider why anyone would kill another. Fear, greed, power or hate, often a combination of those traits. So ask yourself, who might exhibit those traits? Prologue. The Storm. 25 years ago. 20 years before the assembly. "Forget about the paddles, idiot!" Drake yelled to his younger brother, above the wind and thunder as the downpour from the squall beat on them mercilessly. "Just hang on!" The storm rolled in so quickly that the boys had no time to react. The waves were choppy, tossing their wooden fishing boat up and down as if it were a small coin that someone was flicking up in the air and then catching as it landed. The sky was black, and visibility past the end of the boat near non-existent. With each toss of the boat, more water splashed inside. The older boy tried to reach one hand to grab a life jacket that slid past him, but he hadn't been quick enough, and it lodged inside under a downturned bucket at the front of the boat. Bryce gripped the seat beneath him with both hands at his older brother's instructions. "What are you going to do?" he yelled over his shoulder as the sharp rain pelted him in the face. "I'm going for the life jackets!" Drake wiped the drenched hair from his eyes and tried to stand before the tossing of the boat landed him with a hard thud onto the wooden seat. "Let me try, I'm closer!" The younger boy lifted out of his seat and cautiously reached an arm out in front, feeling around the wet floor until he touched what he thought must be the strap of one of the vests. "I've got it!" he began to say, before the next wave overtook them, knocking him off the boat and into the frigid water. A loud thunderclap erupted, followed by an electrically lit sky. "Bryce!" the older boy screamed. The sky went black again. Moments after, the boat lurched onto its side, sending him into the lake before landing on top of him, cracking the side of his head in the process. Bryce resurfaced, gasping for air and flailing his arms frantically. He circled his arms over the top of the downturned boat and hugged it for life. "Drake! Where the hell are you?" A crack of lightning lit up the sky once more, just long enough for Bryce to see a head surface from the water. "Drake! Over here!" he yelled. "Swim this way!" As instructed, the head began to move toward the boat, and it was only when it was several feet in front of him that the young boy could tell that this wasn't his brother. Staring back at him was a blue face with black eyes that looked more like large buttons. Its skin had the texture of a crocheted plush toy, and its hair was stringy, like indigo yarn. Just when the boy had convinced himself that it was the head of an abandoned toy that somehow ended up in the water, it blinked. Bryce began to scream as the blue figure slowly drew itself out of the stormy seas, suspended in the air. It turned to look at him. The creature's chest was bare, and he wore ragged blue jeans that seemed like an afterthought. His body had the same pattern as his face. Otherwise, he had 2 arms and 2 legs and was almost human. "I don't know who the fuck you are," the boy yelled at the figure, "but you gotta help me find my brother." The figure stared at the boy intently, as if doing mental calculations. Bryce fell silent, somehow understanding that his fate was at the mercy of this blue creature. From the scowl on the creature's face, Bryce feared it would sooner kill him than help his brother. The creature came to a decision, stretching one hand out over the water. Moments later, Drake's body floated to the surface. Bryce began to scream again, his words incoherent as tears flooded his face. The button eyes followed the scream, as the boy's eyes grew wider in fear. The creature outstretched his other arm, and Bryce found himself being lifted out of the water, hovering several feet above the waves. As quickly as it had begun, the storm faded, and the night rolled in. Bryce felt himself being carried like a cat by the scruff of its neck, across the water alongside his brother, finally being deposited gently onto the nearest mangrove island. He struggled to balance among the meandering root system of the red mangroves that served as their floor. His brother lay limp along the small patch of wet sand. The creature stood over Drake, once again lost in thought. A moment later, he flicked Drake on his back and touched a finger to his chest. With a jolt, the older boy's chest rose. His upper body lifted in midair, and then he fell back to the ground. Water poured from his mouth as he choked air back into his lungs. He turned with eyes glazed over to look at his saviour. "Drake!" his brother called, stumbling toward him. At the sound of his name, Drake sat upright, shivering. Bryce knelt beside him, throwing his soggy arms around him in an embrace. "I thought you were dead," he cried. "He was," said the blue creature's deep voice. "Who the hell are you?" Bryce croaked out as the creature turned his back on the boys and began to walk into the lake. "Morphani," the blue creature announced over his shoulder. "I am Vitruthian." This meant nothing to Bryce, but as the creature began to descend into the lake, he remembered. "Thank you," he called. Morphani nodded slightly at the acknowledgement. "Wait!" Drake found his voice. "You can't just leave us here. Bluehead! No one knows we're here! We have no food or water!" "You should have known better," Morphani chastised, his eyes growing dark. "Being at sea in weather such as this, with no provisions." Once again he began calculating thoughts. His button eyes turned momentarily to Bryce, and something in his heart softened. But, he thought, the boy did say thank you. Humans hardly ever did that. Finally he answered, "I will see that you have help." With that, he descended into the lake.
Cepheus, please help us.
7-year-old Lucene Jones concentrated as hard as she could, scrunching up her face until it hurt. She sat strapped into the back seat of her parents' green utility vehicle, hugging a plush black cat toy for comfort. The rain poured down violently, pelting the hard black top, making it sound as if the rain and thunder were coming from inside the vehicle. Lucine's mother, Dora Jones, kept gripping the center armrest with both hands, twisting her body uncomfortably to check on Lucine in the back seat. "I'm going to pull over at this next rest stop," her father Zan yelled above the storm, white-knuckled hands gripping the steering wheel. Dora nodded in agreement.
Don't worry, Lucine. Daddy's going to pull over the car until the rain passes. It'll be okay,
her mother comforted. Her mother's words didn't match her feelings. She too was afraid. Lucine could feel it.
Why don't you work on one of your meditations? It'll help you calm down.
Lucine nodded. She'd been doing that very thing. She imagined an open red door in front of her. Through it was the storm. She watched the storm at a distance as she moved further and further from the door. With her mind's eye, she slammed it shut, drowning out the thunder and lightning trapped behind it. Lucine tried again, this time whispering aloud.
Please, Cepheus, could you please help us? We're really scared.
From light years away, Cepheus replied, "I will try." Lucine took comfort in that, and was just beginning to relax a little, when she felt the car jolt. Her mother screamed as the SUV swerved off the road and began tumbling over and over, leaving Lucine hanging from her seatbelt. She felt pieces of glass shatter around her, some of them embedding into her skin as the rain poured into the car. The last thing she remembered was a painful shock running through her before everything went black. Cepheus felt the energy of a lightning bolt shoot through him, awakening him from his meditation with a sudden start. He looked down at his arms in surprise, but noticed no visible signs of any trauma. He tried once again to mentally connect with Lucine first, and then her parents, to no avail. He uncrossed his legs and stood clumsily, taking a moment to lean over and place his hands on his knees as if to both stretch his limbs and catch his breath. A tear rolled down his otherwise expressionless face. He left the meditation room, softly closing the door behind him. "Well?" Tanager asked, eagerly noticing his older friend and mentor's blank expression. "What happened?" The young man paused from the ornate wood sculpture he was carving. "Nothing. Nothing," Cepheus whispered, hanging his head. "They are gone. She is lost." 1. The hospital room. 25 years ago, 20 years before the assembly. "Well, Miss Fortunata, it appears that you were well named." Dr. Archibald Ennis peered over his clipboard at the plump girl squirming in the hospital bed, who was attempting in vain to unravel herself from an ill-fitting robe and a tangle of bedsheets. "We just let your parents know that you're going home today. Bet you're glad about that." Fatima Fortunata let out a giggle.
I sure am.
Dr. Ennis smiled back. "They'll be up in a few minutes. You just sit tight." Fatima wasn't sure she knew how to sit tight, or loose for that matter, her facial expression turning to one of deep contemplation as she gave it some thought. Dr. Ennis passed by the second hospital bed and paused to look at the less fortunate Lucine. He tried to smile encouragingly during his quick retreat out the door. Young Lucine let out a sigh. When were her parents coming to get her, she wondered, feeling a sudden bitterness in the pit of her stomach. She looked down at the strange new fern patterns on her arms. According to the doctors, who were unaware of Lucine's keen sense of hearing while they were discussing her condition at the nurse's station with some child services something or other, she had been struck by lightning. They were watching for signs of numbness or tingling in her arms, dizziness or headaches. So far, she exhibited none of these symptoms, and the doctors were somewhat baffled.
What happened to your arms?
Fatima asked, now standing at Lucine's bedside barefoot.
Lightning. It hit me and left these patterns on my arms. Does it hurt?
Fatima looked concerned.
Nah, I think it might be permanent. Cool.
Fatima squealed enthusiastically. She thought about this some more.
I read in my comic book, not the one I have over there.
She shook her head as she waved her hand at the book that lay face down on the end table beside her bed.
But the one I have at home where this guy got struck by lightning and he had supernatural powers. What are supernatural powers?
Lucine wrinkled her nose, sitting up with interest.
No, silly.
Fatima let out a giggle.
Supernatural, like being able to fly or super strength or the ability to read minds.
Lucine was doubtful of this ability, but was willing to give it a try.
Okay, let's see. Without actually telling me, think of your age and I'll try to guess by reading your mind.
Fatima clapped her hands.
Oh, goody, you're fun. The last time I was in here, the girl didn't want to play or even talk to me.
She furrowed her brows and thought of her age with all of her might. Lucine closed her eyes and pretended her forehead was a movie screen, and she watched it to see what would appear. She turned her head slightly to the left, then right, and smiled.
You'll be 9 in a few days. Your birthday is Thursday.
Lucine blurted out, not really sure where that information came from. Fatima's eyes flew wide open.
Oh my gosh, you are supernatural. How'd you do that? I don't know,
Lucine confessed, though there was something familiar about the experiment. But her head felt a little fuzzy and she was having trouble remembering much of anything.
I just saw you blowing out a cake with people standing around you, like a party or something, and there were 9 candles on the cake. That's amazing. But where did Thursday come from? I heard this song in my head. I don't remember ever hearing it. It was talking about Thursday's child, so I figured it had to be this Thursday.
Fatima's eyes grew wide with admiration.
Wow.
A nurse walked by the room, pushing a metal cart, pausing to scowl at Fatima. She pressed a finger to her lips to encourage Fatima to be quiet.
Okay, let me try.
Fatima whispered, checking to make sure that the nurse had passed.
You think of your age, Kay?
Without asking permission, Fatima climbed up on the edge of Lucine's bed. Lucine bent her knees, hugging them close to her to make extra room.
Okay.
Lucine thought of her age as clearly as she could.
8. No. 9, like me. No. You can't be 10. You're too little. You're not 10, are you? I'm 7. That was my next guess. How come you're in here?
Lucine wanted to know.
I have an arrhythmia,
Fatima declared as a point of pride, dramatically waving her hands in the air for emphasis.
My heart beats funny, but not in the normal way that an abnormal heart beats. It's mysterious and very rare. My mom says it's because I'm so musical. You seem awfully happy about it.
Lucine seemed doubtful.
I'm always happy,
Fatima answered with a shrug, as if that explained everything. And in some way, it did.
Fatima!
An older version of Fatima bounced into the room, bringing a boatload of energy and smiles with her.
Hi, Mom.
Fatima climbed off the bed. Lucine watched as Fatima's mum wrapped her in a big hug. She wished her mum would hurry up and get here. Her heart sank a little. Something about the feeling told her this was never going to happen. She choked back a tear as Fatima introduced her.
This is Lucine. She's my new friend, and she's got superpowers. Does she?
Fatima's mum played along, her eyes growing wide.
How wonderful.
She put out a hand and gently shook Lucine's.
It's nice to meet you, Lucine.
Lucine felt a warm glow rise from where the woman touched her hand all the way up her arm. She smiled back. It was almost as if the woman had hugged her too. Glancing down at the girl's arms, Fatima's mother became aware of the dark, tree-like brown patterns on them, but thought it impolite to mention them. To Fatima, she said,
Your father is pulling up the car, and the nurse will be up in a minute so we can check you out. Okay, let me just get my stuff.
Fatima went to grab her kid-sized hot pink suitcase, while her mother dashed to the nurse's station to confirm that someone would be along shortly. Fatima's suitcase rolled loudly across the white hospital floor as she passed Lucine's bed.
Here.
Fatima paused and handed her a business card.
This is my calling card. You have a card?
Lucine seemed surprised.
I thought only grown-ups had those. I'm in the advanced classes,
Fatima said matter-of-factly and without boast, as if this explained why a nearly 9-year-old would need a business card.
It has my full name on it, see? If you ever end up in Florida, you can come visit me.
Fatima gave her new friend a hug.
See you, Lucine.
She waved as she met her mother at the door.
Take care, Lucine. I'm sure your parents will be along in no time to collect you.
Perhaps Fatima was more supernatural than she realized, since Lucine was in New York and saw no reason why she would ever end up in Florida. She certainly did not expect to see her new friend any time soon, at least not by her definition of soon. Lucine looked down at the calling card, as if it carried with it some luck. Fatima Fortunata, the top line read. Beneath it, Parish, Florida. 2. The Assembly. 5 years ago. Lucine sat in the assembly room, where more than 215 Earth representatives from the United States gathered for the Intergalactic Peace Project's, aka IPP, annual conference, sponsored this year by the United Commonwealth, aka UC. Above their heads, they were surrounded by a series of large flat screens, each one reflecting the representatives of Earth along with those of neighbouring planets in their own gathering places. Some were in giant lecture halls, like the one Lucine was in, while others could be found in large outdoor coliseums. The agenda was lengthy, and a solid 4 hours was planned for today's meeting. From the look of it, there were 9 planets in attendance, 3 fewer than last time. This was cause for concern. She tugged nervously at the hem of her blouse. It scratched at her skin, and felt almost as uncomfortable as her restrictive polyester pants and close-toed foot crushers, falsely advertised as shoes. Business attire never felt quite right to her. It was as if she were expected to wear a Halloween costume for 48 weeks of the year.
We can easily communicate with beings from other solar systems, but we can't seem to master business casual.
For the 1,000th time, she fumbled with the translation headset wrapped tightly over the top of her head and snaking down the side of her face. It kept getting tangled in her blonde locks in spite of her repeated attempts to smooth her already abnormally straight hair. Somehow, she managed to set off a loud screech from the headset that had everyone in the assembly eyeing her with at least a minor level of annoyance. Lucine hated technology. More specifically, anything she considered an unnatural, wave-like connection to something else, such as wireless fidelity or virtual keyboards. In her mind, they were too easy to intercept and even corrupt. She got by with her headset by reminding herself that she could unplug it at any time.
Sorry,
she called, not realizing her microphone volume was still set on max. A few executives jumped, tugging their headphones from their ears at the sudden vocal interruption. Lucine quickly set herself to mute. Her boss, Drake Cushing, turned his head casually in her direction, grinned slightly out of one corner of his mouth, and then shook his head. Lucine let out an embarrassed sigh and slunk back in her seat. This was her first invitation to attend the conference, and now she feared it might be her last. The other scribes around her did not seem to notice the eruption, too busy typing rapidly on the hologram keyboards in front of them, their words projected onto the front of drop-screen visors that fell over their eyes. The visors themselves were attached to their translation headsets, making the group appear more android-like than human. Only they could see what they were typing. There were also a few archaic laptops and a couple of daring early adopters of mind-to-text technology, who sat in deep concentration as their thoughts were translated onto the visor in front of them. The latter was not yet perfected, and the scribes could be heard mumbling, "delete" and "replace" under their breath. Then there was Lucine, the only person in the room with a pad of paper and a pen. Recording and photographing devices were not permitted, except by an official member of the council, and Lucine was not, resigning herself to a mid-level government position. A few of the other scribes looked over her shoulder, perplexed. One young sharp-nosed, auburn-haired woman leaned over and whispered into the ear of the man sitting beside her. She pointed at Lucine's notepad and stifled back a laugh.
Who let Lucy the teenage blogger in?
She asked, reading Lucine's name tag as she spoke. The man beside her shifted uncomfortably in his seat and chuckled nervously. Lucine was tired of being mistaken for a teenager. She was, after all, 27. It's just that her body seemed to think she was still only 17. The woman eyed the tree-like lightning marks on Lucine's arms. Lucine pulled at the edges of her three-quarter-sleeve blouse in a futile attempt to cover them fully. Most of the time, she forgot they were there, except when someone paid special attention to them.
Well, your information can be hacked from a million miles away. Mine, someone would have to physically take from me. And it still wouldn't matter because no one would be able to read my shorthand anyway.
The sharp-nosed woman looked surprised at being heard from such a distance.
To each her own.
Sitting back with a complacent grin, she snapped her visor back in place and adjusted her headphones. Lucine choked back a response, secretly wishing the woman's virtual keyboard would suddenly display all the letters inside out, making her notes illegible. "May I have your attention, please?" the facilitator on the central large monitor announced. "The gathering shall now commence. Make yourself ready." There was a short pause between the facilitator's comments as the universal translator found the closest match to English or Spanish. During these meetings, Lucine occasionally liked to slip her headphones off and listen to whichever planet advisor was leading the session. Their native tongue, while mostly incomprehensible to her, was beautiful and fascinating. Though today, with the new headphones, she dared not, in case she accidentally caused another disturbance. Today's speaker was from Trappist, a planet about 40 light-years away. She watched as his bulky form projected outward from the screen, making it appear as if he was standing in the room with them. The likeness was so real he could have passed for a live person had he not been hovering in mid-air with a translucent glow around him. While he had 2 eyes, a nose, 2 ears, and 2 hands, that's where the similarities between he and earthlings ended. Section 5 inhabitants moved on 4 limbs, 2 of which were retractable, depending on whether the limb's owner opted to walk on 2 legs or run like a wolf on all 4. Underneath his silver uniform, wrinkled grey-blue fur was the other obvious differentiator. For those who do not know me, my name is Coons Malaya. I am the Monarch of Silver from the western region of Trappist in Section 5. I am honoured to be with you all today. We will open with the setting of intentions. For the next 5 minutes, Coons read through the IPP Creed to uphold peace at all costs, to be compassionate to brother and sister planets, to make open communication a priority. All things that sounded wonderful to Lucine when she first arrived. But, like others, the more she saw of war, hypocrisy of planets fighting in the same way that countries on Earth fought, of death and disease, the less enthusiastic she became about her role recording and collecting all of this data. In fact, at this moment she wanted nothing more than to go home, climb into bed, and bury her head under the covers. Today we open our discussion with the most pressing cause for concern. Coons frowned. For this we invite Cepheus Baruch of the planet Erde in Section 1 to take the floor. One of the tall screens moved out from the wall as Cepheus's hologram stood in front of them, high in the air. He wore a plaid sweater vest over a long-sleeved cream-coloured dress shirt and long black dress slacks, which told her that he was not only trying to appeal to the Earth audience, but more specifically to those in the northern regions of the planet. "Thank you, Monarch, and good morning, Assembly," he said. Chills ran through her when Cepheus began to speak. There was something familiar about his deep voice, she couldn't determine why. The most human-like, those living in Section 1, had almost all the same features with 2 exceptions. 1, they had the capacity to heal from injury much more quickly, and 2, their life expectancy was more than double that of a human. Consequently, they aged much more slowly than humans. And it was rumoured that Cepheus Baruch was born among the royals in Section 3, giving him unique ability to transform into lizard form in self-defence, and even grow back arms and legs if they were somehow removed. In her 8 years working for the United Commonwealth, she'd never seen anything of the sort of those from Section 1 or 3, and thought the whole thing was a silly legend. She observed the speaker. Lucine felt a gentle warmth start at her heart and move outward towards her arms, legs, and face, followed by a gentle buzzing through her entire being. She sat upright and began to smile, as if she had just rediscovered a long-lost friend, but caught herself. After all, she didn't know this man. Did she? She'd only heard about him through past conferences. Lucine refocused her attention to the meeting at hand.
What the heck?
A sharp-nosed woman behind her protested.
My keyboard is not projecting properly. It's like it's reflecting upside down and backwards. How can I possibly take notes on this?
Lucine withheld a smile. Really, she hadn't meant to do that. Mostly not.
"Here, let me see," the man sitting behind her whispered. "Maybe it's something with the settings."
She reluctantly unclipped her visor and handed it to him. He, in turn, temporarily replaced his visor with hers.
Looks fine to me."
She snatched it back as he was still removing it.
It's not fine, but I'll have to type without looking and hope for the best.
The man shrugged, returning his attention to the meeting. As most of you know, Cepheus began solemnly, Erde has a special interest in supporting the inhabitants of Earth and their mission to recreate an environmentally sustainable world. Many nodded. Others remained expressionless. Unfortunately, there have been some disturbing patterns of late. Please share with us what you mean by disturbing, Kunz encouraged. We've noticed within the past 200 years the depletion of Earth's natural resources, unusual weather patterns leaving disastrous conditions behind, the decreased availability of water, increased pollution, subjection to toxic elements, including damaging rays from the sun and ill health of all species on Earth. A murmur from the crowds ensued, mostly from Earth representatives, some present in the room and several others from their remote locations, their grim faces clearly visible on their screens. Order, please, Kunz addressed the crowd. Cepheus, please continue. About 30 years ago, before the IPP was in existence, the people of Erde decided to try and intervene on the Earth's behalf by sending representatives to collect data on the existing conditions in an effort to discover a solution. Data collectors who pretend to be humans, moving in secret amongst us. Drake Cushing interjected loudly from his seat. Please, Drake, Kunz intervened, reading Drake's name tag for reference. Cepheus has the floor. We will hear responses momentarily. My apologies, Monarch. Drake slid his headset off in frustration and ran his hand through his thick wavy hair before putting his headphones back in place. He crossed one leg over the other, resting his ankle on his thigh. He tapped his upturned shoe with a stylus pen in obvious annoyance. Lucine was surprised. Usually her boss was exceptionally calm. She didn't understand this current state of agitation. It is true, Cepheus continued. We did move in secret because we had no idea how humans would respond to our presence on their planet. And as you know well, in the interest of, as you would say, transparency, we informed the IPP of our data collectors as soon as a division was formed. They have since been entered into the International Registry of Alien Residency. And what happened after they were added to the IRAR? The monarch asked, sympathetically. They began to die off. More specifically, someone or several people began to kill them. Lucine could have sworn that Cepheus shot her a direct look of warning as he spoke. A wave of panic swallowed her. You must protect yourself, Lucine. Cepheus's voice spoke to her, but not through the translation headphones. She heard his voice from inside her head. Lucine stared back at Cepheus's hologram, astonished. How did he do that? More importantly, how did he know her birth name? She'd been going by Lucy since she was a child. Cepheus quickly averted his gaze. The crowd erupted with holograms appearing all over the room, as other realms tried to take the floor. Order and dignity, please, Kunz exclaimed, and one by one began to mute both the audio and hologram visuals for their screens around the room. Cepheus, please continue. You have about 1 minute to finish your presentation before I must give the floor to someone else. Thank you, Monarch. The fear is more than just the safety of Earth, and the safety of our people, our data collectors. We believe that a group from one of the neighboring sections is involved in this slaughter. Beings who do not wish to see Earth survive. Insanity! Someone from Section 3 proclaimed. To come here and be accused by the so-called peacekeepers! I'm not accusing any specific sections or planets, Cepheus explained to no avail.
I didn't hear him accuse anyone.
Lucine found herself defending this man she didn't know. She went through the filing system in her brain to try and remember. Ah, she thought, the Royals. The Royals were nomads, A very aggressive group that was constantly seeking to take over uninhabited planets to claim as their own. Many of the other sections nicknamed them the Royals as an insult to their narcissistic and elitist ways. Somehow they took it as a compliment, so the name stuck. They had a tenuous relationship with the IPP at best. "Requesting the floor, Monarch!" Drake Cushing stood. Cepheus bowed and stepped back, his hologram fading as he did so. The monarch acknowledged Drake's deference to the order of things and granted him the floor next. Drake stood and quickly made his way to the circular platform at the front of the room. "Thank you, Monarch." Drake nodded to the facilitator, as was customary. To the crowd he said, "Cepheus Baruch claims that the data collectors came here 30 years ago in the effort of helping the Earth by deceptively posing as humans to collect information about us." There was a murmur from the crowd. "But isn't it true that your planet has at least a dozen quote-unquote preservation areas designed to support human life where you're absconded with members of the human race against their will?" "No," Cepheus answered from his station on Erde, his hologram resurfacing above them. "Our preservation areas were set up by the Terrestrial Academy of Research and Awareness to provide a safe place for humans should the Earth prove unsustainable. Lucine had heard of Tara, but she always thought it was more like an intergalactic university that welcomed many species to meet and study there." Preservations? This was new information to her. "Ah, yes, Tara," Drake mocked, looking up at him. "Does Tara's research include human experimentation in the interests of science?" "Absolutely not," Cepheus was flustered. Other attendees in his group shook their heads in anger at the accusation. Over his shoulder, a younger man with a mop of curly hair peered at Lucine curiously. She caught his gaze momentarily, before averting her eyes. In a room of this size, she reasoned, and with so many neighbouring planets in attendance, it's ridiculous to think that either of these men were looking directly at her. "Must be like a painting in a museum where the eyes seem to follow you." "Isn't it more accurate," Drake paused for emphasis, "that your data collectors were killed by humans in self-defense when they refused to return to your planet with you?" "No, that is untrue." "So there are no humans currently living on Erde, then?" There was a pause. "There are," Cepheus answered, honestly. "But they came with us of their own free will." There was a loud uproar from all audiences, and Cepheus' protests went unheard. "Order and dignity, please," Kunz protested, and the crowd slowly settled down. "I don't recall anyone from Section 1 notifying the IPP of humans being relocated to another planet, do you?" Drake addressed the crowd, waving his arm and surveying the room for the answer he already knew. This was news. "You say you come in peace," Drake yelled above the crowd, which was getting louder by the minute. "But isn't it true that Erde is keenly interested in occupying Earth and moving the humans out indefinitely?" "No." Cepheus's eyes became flooded as if injected with a yellow dye, and his nose began to shift, taking on an almost beak-like appearance. He closed his eyes and took a few breaths. Lucine felt herself become agitated on his behalf. She surveyed the growing unrest in the lecture hall, as many attendees were now on their feet and protesting upward at Cepheus's hologram. Moving files out. Was this related to the files Drake recently asked her to procure for the International Registry? She was pulled back from her thoughts. "For this reason, I move that Erde and all planets in Section 1 be banned from the IPP and be entered into investigation," Drake demanded. "Let us explain." The curly-haired man appearing behind Cepheus jumped to his feet. "You, sir," Drake addressed him, "do not have the floor. Be silent." The commotion continued as Kuhn's Malaya tried in vain to calm the heated discussions in the forum. In all of this time as monarch and IPP member, he'd never seen this level of contention before, and wondered what he was missing. Lucine surveyed the scribes surrounding her, all feverishly typing their observations. She folded her notepad and tucked her pen away.
"Excuse me,"
she said to the people who occupied the seats beside her. They leaned back into their chairs to let her pass. Once in the aisle, she made one final glance back at Cepheus's hologram, who looked back at her with a nod, before returning to the chaos. She made her way out into the hallway and toward the building's exit. "Excuse me, Lucy," a burly security guard stopped her. "Aren't you forgetting something?" Lucine looked down at a notepad.
Sorry, my brain doesn't seem to be working right today,"
she joked nervously. "Happens to the best of us," the guard smiled. No information of any kind left the building without permission. Written, audio, or visual content was carefully curated and approved before any of it reached the media and the outside world. She'd have to leave her notes in her lockbox in the resource room. Lucine quickly made her way down the hall past the IPP offices to the opaque glass doors at the end. She paused in front of them as a translucent red light passed over her form. "Welcome, Lucy," the computer greeted her, and the door automatically slid open. She slipped over the threshold and made her way to the lockbox as the door closed behind her. Lucine never did return to the IPP summit that day. In fact, she never returned to the United Commonwealth building ever again. After locking up her notes, she darted past security and out onto the streets of Manhattan. She breathed a sigh of relief as she exited the property, as if she had somehow been held prisoner there and someone might stop her at any time and prevent her from leaving. She began walking toward her apartment, mentally making her escape plan.
"Escape from what?"
she asked herself. She didn't really know, but somehow Cepheus's warning echoed in her head. "You must protect yourself, Lucine." Moments later, she caught the unusual scent of sulfur. She jolted in panic as one might experience during a hypnagogic jerk, just before falling asleep. Then an explosion shocked the ground. Lucine turned to see smoke billowing out of the Commonwealth building, followed by crowds of people fighting their way through the doors on the first floor. On the upper levels, government employees shuffled onto emergency escape hatches that sprang into place once the upper windows had been triggered, sliding one by one down toward the street below. Lucine stood motionless as sirens surrounded and ambulances and military trucks pulled up to the scene. "Stand back!" A police officer waved an arm in front of her and the onlookers that had gathered around Lucine without her noticing. The police began roping off the area, with many of Lucine's colleagues on one side and her on the other. Through the smoke, she saw her boss rushing from the building, a handkerchief held over his face. Even from this distance, she could see that he was limping slightly. Under normal circumstances, she would have stayed to make sure those she knew were safe and to offer her testimony to investigators. But somehow, she knew that the best course of action was simply to blend in with the mounting crowds and disappear. 3. The Terrestrial Academy of Research and Awareness. Tara. 1 year ago. 4 years after the assembly. Students of the Terrestrial Academy of Research and Awareness, or TARA as it was known, behaved much like students on Earth. And save for a few refugees from neighbouring planets, most looked like humans as well. The Academy was founded as a way to educate students about Earth and other alien species and their cultures. One of its advanced training tracks was specifically targeted toward Earth studies and included those who would eventually work on one of the many human preserves on Erde. They would be teaching humans the skills to evolve as a species in order to adapt to varied climates while protecting them until it could be determined if Earth could continue to be habitable for humans. or if other arrangements needed to be made. In return, humans living on preserves shared as much as they could with Tara to ensure the success of the mission. Other tracks included environmental research and development, in which Tara scientists examined collected data about the ecology and resource partitioning on Earth and created systems for the restoration of Earth's natural balance, assuming they could convince key world leaders to adopt them. Last, and arguably the most enviable track, was that of the data collectors, the ones who would make the year-long journey to Earth on special assignment to collect information in their speciality, be it oceanic, freshwater, flora, fauna, substrate, human behaviour, weather conditions, and the like. Upon arrival, many data collectors opted to remain on Earth and report back throughout their lifespan. But when the IPP was formed just over 4 years ago, data collectors began disappearing in large numbers. Many others had been found dead under questionable circumstances. Travels to Earth had been halted, but given the 3-year commitment required for proper training, it was decided that classes should continue. For now. A mild-mannered professor wandered through the long hallway towards Cepheus's office, passing dozens of students ranging from the very young to very old, and each dressed in a variety of garb, if at all. Not wanting to stifle anyone's free will, no major restrictions were put on dress code at the academy. That respect for personal choice had always been a distinguishing quality of those living on Erde, and that culture was particularly evident at the school. The one complaint had been when several students decided to attend class garmentless, which disturbed the sensibilities of more conservative students and professors who were simply worried about hygiene. A compromise had been reached, and those students agreed to at least wear a bathrobe or toga-like cover-up while in class. Being a more empathetic planet, conflicts were generally resolved quickly, and Erde enjoyed the distinction of having planet-wide peace for more than 100 years. So much so that they became known as the peacekeepers to neighbouring planets within the galaxy. The professor knocked softly on the office door. "Cepheus, my friend, may I enter?" He pushed the door open just enough to peer around the corner at the tall man hunched over his work desk at the far end of the room. His features were shrouded by the black hooded cape he'd taken to wearing. "Yes, of course, Tanager," Cepheus replied, almost in a whisper. "Come in." Cepheus's dimly lit office was something to behold, resembling a cross between an overstuffed library and an inventor's workshop. The room was filled wall to wall and ceiling to floor with books, electronic devices, blueprints and scientific models. Contraptions hung from the ceiling and cluttered the tabletops. The windowsill above his desk housed an array of green plants, all competing for sunlight. "Your students missed you today," Tanager offered, resting his brown vegetable leather briefcase on top of a pile of books stacked haphazardly next to the desk where his mentor sat. "I'm afraid I'm not nearly as knowledgeable about Earth agroecology as you are." Cepheus turned his head, briefly regarding the younger man standing before him, who was clad in a retro-style tan tweed jacket with matching slacks, and nodded. There was a glaze in Cepheus's eyes, as if he didn't understand what was being said, but preferred to be polite. His nimble fingers returned to their task of unravelling a series of tangled wires that were connected to an intermediate metal contraption with wings that sat motionless on his desk. "We received some news today," Tanager continued, "about Lucine." Cepheus stopped working and looked over his shoulder. "Lucine?" he repeated, quickly shifting through the files of information in his mind, trying to match a memory to his immediate sadness at the sound of her name. "I thought she was dead. Twice." "No, my friend," Tanager continued. "She is very much alive, and she needs our help." "Lucine needs our help?" Cepheus repeated in a low voice. What can we do? According to one of our data collectors, she has resurfaced in Florida. Not dead? No, Tanager confirmed. The car accident? She survived. The assembly? She survived. Then, Cepheus finally concluded, we must go and retrieve her. I wish it were that simple. Tanager sat on the edge of the desk with one foot firmly on the floor. With Earth being such a hostile environment, I don't feel safe sending any of our new recruits under those conditions. Plus, it will take us 2 years round trip to bring her home, and we believe your parents— My parents are dead, Cepheus interrupted, not without a hint of anger. I'm sorry, the royals. We believe they already have a head start on the technology and are capable of travelling to Earth and back much more quickly than we do. If they find her before we get to her, I'm afraid they will torture her, Cepheus finished, as they did the others, as they did me. Yes, Tanager was concerned. They have no idea how her skills work and may damage her in the process or worse. I will go for her, Cepheus announced. Are you certain? I would go with you, of course, particularly since you are still under watch. There was a long pause as Cepheus regarded a box of metal gears on his desk, presumably to operate a clock or similar mechanism. He stared at them intently. If the universe operates like a clock, the planets being in a system of gears all working together to keep the proper time, what will happen if one of those planets stopped turning? How would the rest of the universe survive? He began pulling the small gears out of the box, one by one, and lining them up on the floor at his feet, the only available space left in the room. Cepheus? The man did not respond to Tanager. He was busy, frenetically arranging the gears just so. Tanager let out a sigh. I believe it's time for your medication. Without another word, Tanager put an air syringe up to Cepheus's ear and depressed the plunger, delivering an antipsychotic serum via a fast-paced puff. The slender man's eyes opened wide for a moment in surprise, before his body began to topple forward. Tanager caught him and guided the man as carefully as he could to the floor. He could hear the sounds of students in the hallway just outside the office. Tanager quickly lunged for the door, closing it just as a few students passed by and looked in his direction. Revisiting the man lying on the floor, Tanager removed his own jacket, pulled it up, and tucked it under Cepheus's head like a pillow.